The bright lights of the Las Vegas Hilton International Hotel illuminated the stage like a sunrise trapped inside a building. It was August 1972. Nearly 2,000 people had been standing in line since early morning, hoping to witness what many believed was the greatest performer alive. By the time the orchestra began warming up, more than 20,000 fans filled every seat. The excitement was almost physical, vibrating through the walls of the massive showroom. Some held flowers, others carried homemade signs. Many simply waited with tears already forming in their eyes. They weren't just waiting for a concert, they were waiting for Elvis Presley. Backstage, Elvis stood alone in front of a mirror. His black jumpsuit shimmered beneath the dressing room lights, decorated with silver embroidery that sparkled whenever he moved. A long white scarf rested around his neck, one of dozens he would eventually hand to fans before the night ended. He adjusted his collar. Someone knocked gently. 5 minutes, Elvis. He nodded without turning around. The room became quiet again. He stared at his own reflection. To the audience, Elvis Presley was larger than life. The king. The man whose voice could stop conversations and start memories. But tonight, something felt different. For weeks he had been exhausted. The endless travel, the rehearsals, the pressure to make every audience believe they were witnessing the greatest show of their lives. Some nights he wondered if people still came to hear the music, or simply to see the legend. He quietly whispered to himself, "Let's give them something real tonight." Outside, 8-year-old Daniel Carter sat perfectly still beside his mother. Unlike everyone around him, he wasn't shouting Elvis's name, he wasn't waving, he wasn't smiling. His hands rested tightly in his lap. Around his neck hung an old black scarf. It looked worn, almost forgotten by time. His mother glanced at him. "You okay, sweetheart?" Daniel nodded. He rarely spoke, not because he couldn't, because tonight words felt too heavy. His mother gently squeezed his shoulder. "You don't have to be nervous." "I'm not." His voice was barely louder than a whisper. "I just don't want to forget." Those words pierced straight through her heart. She looked away before he could see tears filling her eyes. Only 18 months earlier, Daniel had been a completely different child. He laughed constantly. He raced bicycles through their Memphis neighborhood. He believed every grown-up knew exactly how the world worked. Then, one afternoon, 2 Army officers arrived at their front door. His father, Sergeant Michael Carter, would never be coming home from Vietnam. Everything changed after that day. The house became quiet. Birthdays felt incomplete. Christmas mornings lost their excitement. Daniel stopped asking questions. Instead, every night he wrapped his father's favorite black scarf around his neck before going to sleep. His mother never stopped him. She knew the scarf had become something more than fabric. It was the last piece of his father he could still hold. Months before leaving for Vietnam, Michael had spent countless evenings playing Elvis records inside their tiny living room. Whenever "Can't Help Falling in Love" played, Michael would lift young Daniel into the air. The boy would laugh until he couldn't breathe. His father would sing loudly, completely off-key. Neither of them cared. His mother used to joke, "If Elvis ever heard you singing, he'd quit music forever." Michael always laughed. "No," he'd smile. "He'd probably laugh right along with us." Those evenings became Daniel's happiest memories. After Michael died, the record stayed untouched. Until one rainy afternoon. Daniel quietly carried his father's old record player into the living room. He placed the needle on an Elvis album. Static crackled. Then, that familiar voice filled the house once again. His mother found him sitting on the floor, holding the black scarf against his face. For the first time since the funeral, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears. That day his mother realized something. Music had reached the place grief couldn't. Several months later, she heard that Elvis would be performing in Las Vegas. She didn't have the money, not even close. The tickets alone cost nearly everything she had saved. Friends told her not to do it. You have bills. You need groceries. It's just one concert. But she knew it wasn't just a concert. It was the last dream Daniel still talked about. Every evening before bed, he'd quietly ask, "Do you think Dad ever saw Elvis?" She never knew how to answer. Finally, she sold her wedding bracelet, the last expensive thing she owned. She bought 2 tickets. They traveled over 400 miles together, bus after bus, hour after hour. Daniel carried only one small backpack. Inside it, an old photograph of his father and the black scarf. Nothing else mattered. Backstage, the orchestra director gave the signal. The announcer stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the crowd erupted before he even finished. "Please welcome," the screaming became deafening, "Elvis Presley!" The curtains exploded open. The spotlight found him instantly. Elvis walked confidently onto the stage. The audience rose to their feet as one. Thousands screamed. Some fainted. Others cried openly. The orchestra launched into C.C. Rider. The room transformed into electricity. Elvis smiled. He moved effortlessly across the stage. Every note landed perfectly. Every joke made the audience laugh. Everything appeared exactly as it always did. But deep inside, he kept noticing faces. A young couple dancing together, an elderly woman clutching a photograph, a little girl holding white roses. Then, for less than 2 seconds, he noticed someone unusual near the front row. A small boy, standing completely still, no cheering, no waving, just watching. Around his neck, a faded black scarf. Elvis looked away as he continued singing. But somehow, his eyes kept drifting back. Something about that child felt impossible to ignore. The boy wasn't looking at a superstar, he was looking at someone as if searching for an answer. Elvis had no idea why, yet for the first time that evening, the lyrics coming from his mouth no longer held all of his attention. His eyes returned to the boy once more. And this time, the boy quietly placed one hand over the old black scarf. Without realizing it, Elvis missed his next step across the stage. The orchestra continued playing. The audience never noticed. But Elvis did. Something inside him whispered, "Don't look away." And in the next few minutes, the entire concert was about to change forever. The applause thundered through the showroom as Elvis finished the final verse of C.C. Rider. The audience erupted. Women rushed toward the front of the stage. Security struggled to keep everyone behind the barrier. Scarves, flowers, handwritten letters, and cameras stretched into the air, all hoping to catch just 1 second of Elvis's attention. Normally, this was the moment Elvis loved. He smiled, he joked, he handed scarves to fans while the orchestra prepared for the next song. But tonight, his attention wasn't on the crowd. It kept returning to the same little boy. The child hadn't moved. Not once. Even now, while everyone around him screamed with excitement, he stood quietly, his hands folded together, his eyes never leaving Elvis. There wasn't excitement in those eyes. There wasn't fear either, only sadness. A sadness far too old for someone so young. Elvis slowly walked toward the front edge of the stage. The orchestra began playing the introduction to the next song. Instead of turning toward the microphone, he stopped. Several musicians exchanged confused glances. This wasn't rehearsed. Colonel Tom Parker, watching from backstage, frowned immediately. Elvis never stopped the show without warning. The audience slowly became quieter. Thousands of voices faded into silence. Only the soft sound of the orchestra remained. Elvis looked directly at the little boy. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. It felt as though 20,000 people had disappeared. Only 2 people remained inside the room, the king and a silent child. Elvis slowly stepped away from the microphone. He raised one hand toward the orchestra. The music stopped. Complete silence. Nobody understood what was happening. Some fans assumed something had gone wrong with the sound system. Others thought Elvis might be feeling ill. A few reporters reached for their cameras. Moments like this rarely happened. Elvis leaned toward the audience. His voice was gentle. "Son," the little boy looked up, "would you come here for a second?" Daniel looked at his mother. His eyes widened. I can't," his mother whispered. "It's okay." "No! There are too many people." Elvis smiled warmly. "You don't have to come to me." The audience watched without making a sound. Instead, Elvis climbed down from the stage. Gasps spread across the room. Security immediately rushed forward. "Mr. Presley?" Elvis quietly shook his head. "No, I've got this." He continued walking until he stood directly in front of Daniel. For the first time that night, the superstar disappeared. There was no performer, no celebrity. Only one man kneeling in front of one little boy. Elvis lowered himself onto one knee so their eyes were level. He smiled. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. "Daniel." "Well?" "It's nice to meet you, Daniel." No answer. Elvis noticed the child's fingers tightly gripping the black scarf around his neck. "You've been holding on to that scarf all night." Daniel nodded. "It belonged to my dad." Elvis's smile softened. "Did he bring you here?" The boy slowly shook his head. "No." Another long silence. Finally, "He can't." Elvis didn't speak. He simply waited. Sometimes silence tells people it's safe to continue. Daniel looked down at the floor. "He died." Those 2 words felt heavier than the entire building. Behind him, his mother quietly covered her mouth. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry tonight. That promise lasted only seconds. Elvis carefully placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry." Daniel didn't cry. He had already cried enough. Instead, he reached into his backpack. Everyone watched curiously. He removed a faded photograph. The edges were worn from being held too many times. It showed a smiling army sergeant sitting on the hood of an old pickup truck. In one hand, he held an Elvis Presley record. Daniel handed the picture to Elvis. "My dad." Elvis studied the photograph carefully. The smile on the soldier's face looked familiar, not because Elvis recognized the man, but because he had seen that smile thousands of times. It was the smile of someone whose music had become part of another family's life. "My dad loved your songs." Daniel's voice trembled. "He used to sing them really loud." A few people in the audience laughed softly through their tears. Daniel managed the smallest smile. He couldn't sing very well. Elvis chuckled. You know something? Neither could I, when I first started. The audience laughed quietly. For a brief moment, the sadness lifted. Then Daniel asked a question that froze Elvis completely. My mom says people never really die if someone remembers them. Elvis looked into the boy's eyes. I hope that's true. Daniel swallowed hard. So, if you sing one of Dad's favorite songs, will everybody here remember him? Just for tonight? The room became perfectly still. Several musicians lowered their instruments. Even security guards looked away to hide their emotions. Elvis didn't answer immediately, because suddenly he couldn't. His throat tightened. He had spent years performing for thousands, but no audience had ever asked him something so simple or so impossible to refuse. Backstage, Colonel Parker checked his watch. The schedule was already several minutes behind. He whispered to one of the stage managers, "Get him back on stage." The stage manager hesitated. I don't think anyone wants to interrupt this. Parker frowned. This is a concert. It has a schedule. Nearby, one of the backup singers quietly replied, No, tonight it's something else. Elvis slowly stood up, still holding the photograph in his hands. He looked across the audience. 20,000 faces stared back. Not a single person spoke. He walked back onto the stage, but before returning the photograph, he kissed the corner of it, then carefully handed it back to Daniel. Take good care of this. Daniel nodded. I always do. Elvis turned toward the orchestra. He didn't announce the next song. He didn't make one of his usual jokes. Instead, he spoke from his heart. When I was a little boy, my mama taught me something. She said music isn't just something we hear. It's something we carry. He looked back at Daniel, and sometimes is the only thing strong enough to carry us. Tears rolled down countless faces. Some strangers quietly reached for each other's hands. Others simply bowed their heads. Elvis took a slow breath, then looked at his pianist. In the key of G. The pianist nodded silently. Everyone on stage understood. This wasn't part of the set list. No rehearsals, no arrangements, only emotion. The first gentle piano notes echoed through the arena. Daniel's breathing became faster. He recognized the melody immediately. It was the same song his father had sung every Sunday morning while making breakfast. The same song that had echoed through their house before everything changed. Elvis closed his eyes. The microphone rose slowly toward his lips. The audience held its breath, waiting for the first words. And before a single lyric was sung, Daniel whispered almost too quietly for anyone to hear, Hi, Dad. The first piano notes floated gently through the showroom. No drums, no horns, no flashing lights, only a single piano. And complete silence. 20,000 people remained perfectly still. Even those sitting in the highest rows leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something that could never be rehearsed. Elvis closed his eyes. Then, almost like a prayer, he began to sing. Wise men say. His voice was softer than usual. It wasn't the powerful voice that filled arenas. It was quieter, warmer, more personal, as if he were singing for only one listener, Daniel. The little boy stood beside the stage, clutching his father's photograph against his chest. His mother wrapped one arm around him, but she could feel his body trembling, not from fear, from memory. As Elvis continued singing, Daniel wasn't looking at the stage anymore. He was somewhere else, back home, years earlier. Sunday mornings, the smell of pancakes filled the tiny kitchen. His father danced around with a frying pan in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. His mother laughed so hard she nearly dropped the orange juice. Little Daniel sat on the kitchen counter kicking his feet. His father pointed the spoon toward him like a microphone. "Come on, partner. We've got an audience," Daniel giggled. "There isn't anybody here." His father winked. "There doesn't have to be." Then together, the two of them sang Elvis songs completely out of tune. Neighbors probably heard every terrible note. Neither of them cared. His father always ended the song the same way. He'd kneel down, straighten Daniel's little collar, and smile. "Remember something, buddy. No matter what happens, you never stop singing." The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Daniel looked back at Elvis. Without realizing it, tears were running down his face. For the first time in almost 2 years, they weren't tears of loneliness. They were tears of remembering. Elvis reached the chorus. His voice grew stronger, not louder, stronger. Every word carried emotion that no microphone could create. As he sang, he noticed something extraordinary happening inside the audience. A woman in the third row quietly removed a handkerchief and handed it to a complete stranger who was crying beside her. An elderly veteran slowly stood up. He removed his military cap. Then another veteran did the same. Soon, one after another, former soldiers throughout the showroom stood silently, holding their caps over their hearts. No one instructed them. No announcement was made. It simply happened. Elvis saw it. He understood immediately. This night had stopped being about entertainment. It had become something much greater. Backstage, Colonel Tom Parker no longer looked at his watch. For the first time all evening, he wasn't thinking about ticket sales or schedules. He simply watched. One of the stagehands quietly whispered, "I've worked with Elvis for 6 years. I've never seen anything like this." Another nodded. "I don't think any of us have." The final chorus approached. Instead of looking toward the audience, Elvis looked directly at Daniel. His eyes were glistening beneath the spotlight. He slowly stepped down from the stage again, still singing. Each step brought him closer to the little boy. The audience held its breath. When Elvis reached the final line, "Take my hand," he stretched out his own hand toward Daniel. The little boy hesitated, then slowly placed his tiny hand inside Elvis's. Together, they finished the final words, "For I can't help falling in love with you." The final piano chord faded into silence. No applause came. Not immediately. The room was too emotional to clap. People simply cried, some openly, some quietly. Others buried their faces in the shoulders of loved ones. Daniel looked up. "Mr. Presley?" Elvis smiled. "Yes, son? My dad used to hold my hand exactly like that." For a brief moment, Elvis couldn't speak. He swallowed hard before answering. "I think he'd be very proud of you tonight." Daniel shook his head. "No, I'm proud of him." Those words hit Elvis harder than any standing ovation ever had. He squeezed Daniel's hand gently. "You should be." Then something unexpected happened. Daniel reached toward the black scarf around his neck. Very carefully, he untied it. The old fabric looked fragile after years of use. He held it with both hands. This belonged to Dad. Elvis nodded respectfully. Daniel looked down. "I've worn it every single day." Another pause. Then, "I don't think I need to wear it all the time anymore." His mother looked at him in surprise. He had refused to remove that scarf even while sleeping. Doctors had suggested it. Teachers had asked. Family members had begged him. He never agreed, until now. Daniel carefully folded the scarf, then held it toward Elvis. "I want you to have it." A wave of emotion swept through the audience. Elvis didn't take it immediately. Instead, he gently closed Daniel's hands back around it. "No. This belongs with your family." Daniel looked confused. "But I wanted you to remember Dad." Elvis smiled through tears. "I don't need the scarf to remember him." He touched the boy's heart gently with 2 fingers. "As long as he's here." "He'll never be forgotten." Daniel stared at him, almost as if trying to understand something much bigger than himself. Then Elvis slowly removed the long white concert scarf from around his own neck, the same kind fans waited hours to receive. He folded it carefully, then tied it around Daniel's neck with the same gentle movement a father might use before sending his son to school. The old black scarf remained underneath. The white scarf rested above it. 2 memories, one from the past, one from tonight. When Elvis finished tying the knot, he quietly whispered so only Daniel could hear, "You don't have to choose between holding on and moving forward. You can carry both." Daniel suddenly threw his arms around Elvis. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but inside that arena, time seemed to stop. Many people would later say they had attended hundreds of concerts, yet they could never remember another moment when 20,000 strangers cried together. As Daniel stepped back, Elvis noticed something tucked inside the boy's shirt pocket. A folded letter, old, creased from being opened many times. The corner revealed handwriting in faded blue ink. Daniel quickly tried to hide it, but Elvis had already seen it. He smiled gently. "Is that from your dad?" Daniel nodded. "It's the last letter he ever sent." Elvis looked at the envelope for a long moment, then quietly asked, "Would you read it to me?" Daniel froze. His hands began to shake. "I've never read it out loud." Elvis rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Maybe tonight is the right night." Daniel slowly unfolded the fragile paper. The entire showroom fell silent once again. His lips parted. He looked at the first line. A tear landed on the page before he could speak. Then, with a trembling voice, he began reading the final words his father had ever written. Daniel carefully unfolded the faded letter. The paper had softened with age. Its corners were worn from being opened hundreds of times, yet every crease had been protected with incredible care. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a father, writing to the people he loved most. His hands trembled. He swallowed hard. Then he began to read. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, it probably means I wasn't lucky enough to come home." A quiet sob escaped somewhere in the audience. Daniel stopped for a moment. His mother gently nodded. He continued, "Please don't let our little boy remember me as a soldier. Let him remember me as the man who burned pancakes every Sunday morning because I was too busy singing Elvis songs." Soft laughter mixed with tears spread through the arena. Even Elvis smiled through wet eyes. Daniel's voice became steadier. "Tell him I loved watching him laugh more than anything in this world. Tell him I carried his photograph everywhere I went. Some nights the only thing that reminded me of home was listening to Elvis on a little military radio. Whenever I heard those songs, I could almost pretend I was back in our kitchen. Several veterans quietly lowered their heads. Some closed their eyes. Others wiped away tears they had spent years refusing to shed. Daniel reached the final paragraph. His voice cracked. "If I don't make it home, please don't let my son carry my sadness. Tell him to carry my love instead. One day, when he hears Elvis sing again, I hope he'll smile before he cries. If that happens, I'll know my little boy is going to be okay. Love forever, Dad." The last word echoed through the enormous showroom. No one moved. No one applauded. For several long seconds, there was only silence, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Daniel slowly lowered the letter. His tears continued falling. But something about them had changed. They no longer looked like the tears of a child trapped inside grief. They looked like the tears of someone finally beginning to heal. Elvis walked toward him. Without speaking, he embraced the little boy once more. This time the hug lasted longer. The audience watched quietly. Then Elvis stepped back and looked across the arena. He lifted the microphone. "I've sung in front of kings. I've sung in front of presidents. I've sung in front of crowds bigger than this." He paused. "But tonight, I met a little hero." Daniel looked up in surprise. Elvis smiled. "It takes courage to stand in front of thousands of strangers, but it takes even greater courage to open your heart after it's been broken." The audience rose to its feet, not because Elvis had finished speaking, because they agreed. Elvis turned toward the orchestra. He nodded once. No more fast songs. The musicians understood immediately. One guitarist quietly switched instruments. The backup singers stepped closer to their microphones. Elvis looked toward Daniel. "This next one is for every family that's waiting for someone to come home." The orchestra began playing "Peace in the Valley." It wasn't on the night's planned set list. No one cared. Every lyric felt personal. Many veterans quietly wrapped their arms around their wives. Several mothers held their children closer. Even security guards stood still. The entire showroom seemed united by one song. When the final note faded away, nobody wanted the night to end. Elvis looked toward his stage manager. He quietly asked for something. A few moments later, someone brought a simple wooden chair onto the stage. Elvis placed it in the center. He invited Daniel to sit beside him. Not as a fan, as a friend. For nearly 10 minutes, the concert stopped being a concert. Elvis asked Daniel about school, his favorite baseball team, his father's old records. The audience laughed whenever Daniel shyly answered. Little by little, the frightened boy everyone had first seen was disappearing. In his place, a smile slowly returned. His mother noticed it immediately. It was the first genuine smile she had seen since her husband died. She quietly covered her face. This time, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. As the evening finally drew to a close, Elvis reached inside his jacket. He removed a small gold guitar pick. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't flashy, but it had traveled with him through countless performances. He placed it carefully into Daniel's hand. "When life gets heavy, I want you to keep this." Daniel stared at it. "I can't take something that belongs to you." Elvis gently closed the boy's fingers around it. "It belongs to you now." "But you have to promise me something." Daniel nodded. "What?" "When you're older, if you ever meet another little boy who's hurting, help him. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be rich. Just remind him that someone believes tomorrow can be better. Daniel nodded with tears in his eyes. I promise. As Elvis prepared to leave the stage, Daniel suddenly called out, Mr. Presley. Elvis turned around. The little boy smiled. For the very first time that evening, it wasn't a sad smile. It was filled with hope. My dad was right. Elvis tilted his head. About what? Daniel looked around the arena, at the thousands of strangers, at the veterans, at his mother, then back at Elvis. He always said, Your songs made people feel less alone. Elvis couldn't answer. He simply placed one hand over his heart. Years passed. The lights of that concert eventually faded into history. New tours came. New songs were written. The world kept moving. But for one family, that night never ended. Daniel grew into a compassionate young man. Inspired by the promise he had made to Elvis, he devoted his life to helping children who had lost parents in military service. He organized music programs, grief support groups, and scholarship funds, believing that healing often began with simply letting someone know they were not alone. On the wall of his office hung three things: his father's photograph, the old black scarf, and Elvis's white concert scarf. Visitors often asked why the two scarves hung side by side. Daniel always smiled before answering. One reminds me where I came from. The other reminds me where I found hope again. When Elvis Presley passed away in August 1977, Daniel stood quietly among thousands of mourners in Memphis. He wore both scarves around his neck, not because they were valuable, but because together they represented two men who had shaped his life. One had given him life. The other had helped him find it again. As he walked away from Graceland that afternoon, he looked toward the sky and whispered the same words he had spoken years earlier in that Las Vegas showroom. Hi, Dad. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. And thank you, Elvis. Sometimes history remembers a concert because of the songs that were sung. Sometimes it remembers the size of the crowd. But those who claimed they were inside the Las Vegas Hilton that unforgettable night would always remember something else. They remembered the moment when the greatest performer in the world stopped chasing applause and started healing a broken heart. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that the most unforgettable performances are not measured by standing ovations. They are measured by the lives they quietly change.